My brother always said blood was thicker than water, but he conveniently forgot that ink on a legal document is thicker than both. He thought he'd stolen my half of our father's legacy right out from under me, and for a little while, I almost let him believe it. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot that while he was busy learning how to count money, I was the one learning how to build things, and I was just about to tear his entire world down to the foundations. My name is Frank Miller, and for the better part of 68 years, I've believed in a few simple truths: a firm handshake, an honest day's work, and the unwavering loyalty of family. My hands tell the story of my life. They're calloused and scarred from 45 years of working in construction, of laying foundations and raising walls under the hot summer sun and in the biting winter wind. It was a life I chose, a life I loved, working side by side with my father in the business he started from nothing, Miller & Sons Construction. There were two sons, me and my younger brother, David. We were like two sides of the same coin, I guess you could say. I was the one who loved the smell of sawdust and fresh-poured concrete. I found a deep, satisfying peace in taking a blueprint and turning it into something real, something that would stand long after I was gone. David was different. He was smart, no doubt about it, but his talents were for things I never quite understood. He could look at a spreadsheet and see a story. He could talk his way into any deal and charm the paint off a wall. Dad always said we were the perfect team. I was the heart and hands of the business, and David was the brain and the voice. For years, that's how it worked. Dad, David, and me. We built Miller & Sons into the most respected construction firm in the county. People knew that if you hired a Miller, the job would be done right. No shortcuts, no excuses. That was Dad's creed, and it became mine, too. After my dear wife, Sarah, passed away from cancer 5 years ago, the business was all I had left, really. It was my connection to my past, to my father, and the one place where things still made sense. David handled the office, the bids, the clients. I ran the crews on the ground, making sure every joint was tight and every foundation was true. I thought we were partners, equals, carrying on our father's legacy together. I thought the name Miller & Sons meant something to him, too. Turns out, he was only interested in the first half of that equation. The betrayal didn't come like a clap of thunder. It was more like a slow, creeping rut that you don't notice until the whole structure is about to collapse. It started the day we sat in a stuffy lawyer's office for the reading of our father's will. Dad had been sharp as a tack right up until the end, or so I thought. He'd always preached fairness. "You boys are in this together," he'd say, his hand clapping me on the shoulder. 50-50, down the middle. That's the only fair way. So you can imagine my shock when the lawyer, a man I'd never seen before, cleared his throat and read the words that blew my world apart. The cash assets, the house, the investments, all to be split evenly. I nodded, that made sense. But then he got to the business. And to my son, David Miller, the lawyer read, "I bequeath my entire ownership stake, 100%, of Miller & Sons Construction." The room went quiet. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I looked over at David, expecting to see the same confusion on his face. Instead, I saw a carefully practiced look of solemn acceptance. He even had the nerve to reach over and pat my hand, a gesture of synthetic sympathy. "I'm as surprised as you are, Frank," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Dad must have had his reasons. But I knew my father. He wouldn't have done this. Not without talking to me. Something was terribly wrong. The lawyer handed me a check. My inheritance. It was a substantial amount of money, don't get me wrong, but compared to the value of the business I had poured my life into, it was a slap in the face. It was severance pay. I stumbled out of that office in a daze. David stayed behind to handle the paperwork. I drove home to the little house Sarah and I had shared for 40 years, the check lying on the passenger seat like a coiled snake. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words from the will echoed in my head. Dad's voice, in my memory, promising me partnership, clashing with the cold, legal ink that had erased me from my own life. The next day, I went down to the company office. It felt strange walking in not as a boss, but as, what was I now? A visitor? David was already there, sitting behind Dad's big oak desk, looking like he'd been born to it. He'd already replaced the photo of me and Dad at the groundbreaking of the old library with a picture of himself accepting some business award. "Frank," he said, standing up with that politician's smile. "Good to see you. We have a lot to discuss." He spent the next hour explaining his vision for the future. A future that involved rebranding, expanding, and, I soon realized, pushing out anyone loyal to me and my father. He explained that the will was Dad's way of protecting me. "Honestly, Frank, you hate the paperwork side of things," he said, leaning back in the chair. "Dad knew that. He didn't want to burden you with running the company. He wanted you to be free to enjoy your retirement." Retirement? I was 68, but I'd planned to die with a hammer in my hand. The lie was so perfectly constructed, so full of false concern, that I almost believed it. But then I saw a file on the corner of the desk. It was one of my old project files, and sticking out of it was a memo I'd never seen before. While David was on the phone, I slid it out. It was a financial report from a job we'd done 2 years ago, and it was full of errors. Falsified numbers that made it look like my crew had gone wildly over budget, that materials had been wasted, that I had been careless. My signature was at the bottom, but it wasn't my signature. It was a clumsy, almost insulting forgery. And then I knew. This wasn't a last-minute decision by a fading old man. This was a long, patient coup. David hadn't just accepted the business. He had stolen it. He had spent years poisoning our father against me, creating a false narrative of my incompetence, all so he could take everything for himself. The feeling that washed over me wasn't just anger. It was a profound, hollow ache. It was the pain of a double betrayal. My brother had not only stolen my future, but he had also stolen my past, rewriting the story of my relationship with my father into one of failure and disappointment. I remembered conversations with Sarah before she passed. She'd always been wary of David's ambition. "He's got a hunger in him, Frank," she'd say. "Just be careful it doesn't one day decide to eat you." I'd always defended him, told her he was just driven, that he was my brother. How could I have been so blind? I thought of the promises Dad and I made to each other over the years, shaking hands on a deal to buy a new piece of equipment, or planning the next big project. All those moments, which I'd held on to as the bedrock of my life, had been built on a lie. While I was out on the job sites, working in the dirt and the dust, David had been in the clean, quiet office, carefully dismantling my life, document by document. I walked out of that office and didn't look back. The check the lawyer had given me sat on my kitchen table for a week, untouched. Every time I looked at it, I felt a fresh wave of sickness. It was blood money. It was the price of my brother's treachery and my own foolish trust. The company name, Miller & Sons, was a cruel joke now. There was only one son who mattered, and it wasn't me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. An old man with a pocket full of cash and a legacy that had been stolen right out from under him. The world I had built, the one I understood, had ceased to exist. For about a month, I just drifted. I'd wake up in the morning and the first thing I'd feel was this heavy, dull weight in my chest. The house was too quiet. Without the early morning routine of heading to the yard, the days felt shapeless, empty. I tried to find new hobbies. I took up fishing again, something Dad and I used to do, but sitting by the lake, all I could think about was how David had fished my inheritance right out of my hands. The worst part was seeing what he was doing to the company. He changed the name first. From Miller & Sons Construction to Apex Development Group. Just like that, Dad and I were erased. I'd see the new company trucks around town, sleek and shiny, with a logo that looked like something a computer would design. It didn't have any soul. Then I started hearing things. Old man Hemlock, who'd been our lead carpenter for 30 years, called me one night. David had let him go. Said they were restructuring, Hemlock said, his voice thick with a pain I knew all too well. Said they needed a younger crew. After 30 years, Frank. 30 years. He wasn't the only one. One by one, David was cleaning house, getting rid of all the old-timers, the men who remembered my father, the ones who knew what a Miller & Sons job was supposed to look like. He was replacing them with cheaper, non-union crews who'd work for less and ask fewer questions. That's when the anger started to burn through the fog of my grief. This wasn't just about me anymore. David was destroying our father's true legacy, a company built on quality and loyalty. He was turning it into just another soulless machine for making money. I knew I couldn't fight the will. David had been too clever, covering his tracks for years. Any legal challenge would be a long, expensive battle that I'd probably lose. He'd just paint me as a bitter old man who couldn't accept his father's final wishes. No, a direct assault was a fool's game. But Sarah always said my greatest strength wasn't my muscle, but my patience. I knew how to build things, and that meant I knew how things were put together. It also meant I knew where the weak points were. So, I started my own quiet project. I used a portion of the inheritance money to set up a small consulting business. FM Quality Inspections. It was just me, a laptop, and a lifetime of experience. I started taking on small jobs, inspecting home constructions for new buyers, offering advice on renovations. It kept me busy, but more importantly, it kept me connected. I started having coffee with my old suppliers, lunch with subcontractors I'd worked with for decades. I never said a bad word about David or Apex. I just listened. And boy, did I hear an earful. I heard that Apex was squeezing suppliers for cheaper materials, stuff that barely met code. I heard that the new crews were sloppy, that they cut corners on safety protocols. I heard that David was promising clients the moon, signing contracts with timelines and budgets that were impossible to meet without cheating somewhere. Every piece of information was like a brick. I was laying a new foundation, one that David couldn't see. He was so busy building his shiny new empire on top of the one he'd stolen, he never thought to look at what was happening in the shadows. He saw me as a retired old man, put out to pasture. He had no idea I was quietly gathering the dynamite that would blow his whole world sky high. The tension was building inside me, a slow, steady pressure. Every time I saw an Apex truck, every time I heard another story about how David was running Dad's business into the ground, it added another layer. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was on a mission. I was going to save my father's legacy, even if it meant destroying my brother to do it. The moment I'd been waiting for came on a Tuesday morning in October. It arrived in the form of a headline in the local paper: Apex Development Group wins bid for new city community center. My hands shook as I held the newspaper. This was it. The biggest, most high-profile project to come to town in 20 years. A 6-story, state-of-the-art facility. It was the kind of legacy project Dad had always dreamed of. And now it was in David's hands. I read the article, and a slow smile spread across my face. David, in his usual style, had given a glowing interview, full of corporate buzzwords and grand promises. He talked about synergy and cutting-edge techniques. But the part that made my heart beat faster was the budget. He'd won the contract by coming in almost 20% lower than the next closest bidder. To anyone else, it looked like a stroke of genius. To me, it looked like a confession. I knew what a project of that scale should cost. I knew the price of steel, the cost of labor, the city's rigorous building codes, especially for a public structure that had to meet seismic safety standards. There was no way, absolutely no way, he could build that community center for that price without cutting corners so sharp he'd slice himself in half. This was my turning point. All those months of patient listening, of gathering information, it was all for this. David's arrogance was about to become his undoing. That afternoon, I called Maria, an old friend who worked in the city planning office. She was a straight arrow, a woman who believed in rules and regulations. We had worked together on dozens of projects over the years, and she respected the Miller and Sons name, the real one. "Frank, good to hear from you," she said, her voice warm. "Congratulations on your brother's big contract." "That's what I'm calling about, Maria," I said. "I've got some concerns." I didn't have to say much. I just asked a few questions, planting seeds of doubt. For that price, is he using domestic or imported steel? Is he planning on using a pre-stressed concrete slab for the foundation? Because the soil composition in that area is tricky. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. I was speaking her language. I wasn't making accusations, I was raising professional questions. "That's interesting, Frank," she said slowly. "The preliminary plans just came in. I'll make sure to give them an extra thorough review. That was all I needed. The plan was now in motion. I knew David. He'd try to get the foundational work done as fast as possible. Once the concrete was poured and the initial steel frame was up, it was a lot harder and more expensive for inspectors to find problems. He was counting on a quick, routine inspection. But he wasn't going to get one. I spent the next few weeks watching the site from a distance. My little consulting business suddenly got very busy with a project that paid nothing but was worth everything. I knew the construction schedule by heart. I knew when the concrete trucks were supposed to arrive. I knew when the first steel beams would be hoisted into place. Then I made my second move. I drafted an anonymous letter. It was a work of art, if I do say so myself. It wasn't from a bitter brother. It was from a concerned citizen with a background in structural engineering. I wrote it on a typewriter I bought at a thrift store, so the font couldn't be traced. I mailed it from a post office in the next town over. The letter was addressed to the head of the city building and safety department. It didn't mention David by name. It just raised a series of highly technical questions about the community center project. It cited specific building codes related to load-bearing walls and seismic resilience. It suggested that a budget of that size seemed insufficient to meet those codes without using substandard materials. It was just enough to make any responsible city official very, very nervous. The trap was set. The bait was laid. All I had to do now was wait for my arrogant, greedy brother to walk right into it. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that he would. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I'd drive by the construction site, a beehive of activity. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The big Apex development signs were everywhere. David was even on the local news, wearing a hard hat that had probably never seen a speck of real dust, talking about bringing the project in on time and under budget. He was so smug, so confident. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. I knew the inspection was scheduled for a Thursday. It was supposed to be a formality, a simple check-off before they moved on to the next phase. But my anonymous letter had done its work. The city didn't just send a junior inspector. They sent Old Man Fitz, a legendary stickler for the rules who was 2 months from retirement and had a reputation for being completely incorruptible. Fitz was a guy who would cite his own mother for a code violation. I'd worked with him for 20 years. He was tough, but he was fair. He was the last person in the world David would want to see on that job site. On that Thursday morning, I parked my truck a block away from the site, at a little coffee shop where I had a clear view. I just sat there, nursing a cup of black coffee, and watched. At precisely 10 a.m., Fitz's city-issued sedan pulled up. He got out, clipboard in hand, and the look on his face was all business. David came out to greet him, all smiles and handshakes. I could almost hear his smooth, charming patter from my truck. He tried to steer Fitz toward the office for coffee, but Fitz just shook his head and pointed toward the steel framework rising from the foundation. I watched them for the next 2 hours. Fitz wasn't just looking, he was measuring. He was tapping on beams, scraping at concrete, comparing what he saw to the thick roll of blueprints he carried under his arm. David's confident posture slowly started to crumble. His arms went from his sides to crossed over his chest. He started pacing. He was making frantic calls on his cell phone. And then I saw it. The moment my entire plan had been leading up to. Fitz walked over to the site foreman, said something, and the foreman's face went pale. Fitz then pulled out a big red tag from his satchel and slapped it onto the main support beam. A stop work order. It was like a scene from a movie. The roar of machinery died down. Workers started putting down their tools. The entire, massive project ground to a halt. David rushed over to Fitz, his arms waving, his face a mask of fury. But Fitz just pointed at the red tag, said a few final words, and walked back to his car. He drove away without a single backward glance. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By the afternoon news, it was the biggest story in town. Safety violations halt community center project. The report was brutal. It quoted an anonymous source from the city, Old Man Fitz, no doubt, who talked about substandard structural steel and concrete mixtures that failed to meet seismic safety specifications. It was fraud, plain and simple. David had tried to build a public building with cheap, dangerous materials to pad his profits. His phone must have been ringing off the hook, but they were no longer calls of congratulations. The city announced a full investigation. The banks froze his credit lines. The story got picked up by the regional news. Apex Development Group went from being the town's rising star to its biggest villain in the span of about 8 hours. I watched it all unfold from my quiet little house. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction. This wasn't just about the money. It was about honor. It was about the Miller and Sons name. David had tarnished it, and I had been forced to be the one to scour it clean, even if it meant using the harshest soap imaginable. The next morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. Frank. It was David. His voice was a wreck. It was thin and reedy, all the smooth confidence gone. Frank, I need your help. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Help with what, David? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Everything's a mess, he stammered. The banks, the city, they're trying to ruin me. It sounds to me, I said, like you ruined yourself. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, the sound of a man drowning in the consequences of his own greed. Please, Frank, he finally whispered. You're the only one who can fix this. You know construction. You can talk to them, tell them it was a mistake. Was it a mistake, David? I asked. Or did you deliberately use cheap steel to make a bigger profit? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. We both knew the truth. The business is going to go under, he said, his voice cracking. Everything Dad built, it's all going to be gone. No, David, I said, and the words felt truer than anything I'd said in years. Everything Dad built is about to be saved. I hung up the phone. The revenge was complete, but my work wasn't finished. Now it was time to rebuild. The collapse of Apex Development Group was faster than even I had expected. With the city investigation, the lawsuits from suppliers he hadn't paid, and the banks calling in their loans, David was finished. He was forced to declare bankruptcy. The shiny trucks, the fancy office, the whole soulless empire he had built on a foundation of lies, it all went up for auction. And I was there, waiting. I had been smart with the inheritance money. I'd invested it conservatively, and it had grown. I also talked to some of the old subcontractors, the loyal guys David had fired. Men like Hemlock. They believed in me. They believed in the Real Miller and Sons. They co-signed a loan with me, pooling our resources. When the assets of Apex went on the block, we bought them for pennies on the dollar. The trucks, the equipment, the company yard, it was all ours. The first thing I did was get a can of paint. I walked over to the big sign at the entrance of the yard, the one that said Apex Development Group, and I painted right over it. In big, bold letters, I wrote Miller and Sons Construction. The name was back where it belonged. The next day, I called every single one of the old employees David had let go. Hemlock, I said, I've got a job for you if you want it. The relief in his voice was something I'll never forget. One by one, the old crew came back. It was like a family reunion. There were handshakes and backslaps and more than a few misty eyes. We were putting the soul back into the business. Then I went to see the city. I walked into the planning office with a new proposal for the community center. It wasn't the cheapest bid. In fact, it was the most expensive. But it came with a guarantee. A guarantee that every beam would be the highest grade American steel, that every yard of concrete would exceed safety standards, and that the work would be done by the most experienced craftsmen in the state. It came with the Miller and Sons guarantee. They gave us the contract. 2 weeks later, as we were preparing to restart work on the community center, David showed up at the yard. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit was rumpled, and the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow desperation. Frank, he said, standing in the doorway of the office, my father's old office. I have nowhere else to go. I looked at him, my brother, the man who had tried to erase me from my own life. I felt a flicker of something, maybe pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of his betrayal. What do you want, David? I asked. "A job," he said, his eyes on the floor. "I'll do anything. Sweep the floors, answer the phones. I need a chance." I stood up and walked over to the company safe, the same one Dad had used for 50 years. I spun the dial, opened the heavy door, and took out a check. I wrote it out carefully and handed it to him. He looked at it. It was for the exact amount of the inheritance my father had left me. The severance pay. "What's this?" he asked, confused. "That's your half," I said. "The half you tried to steal from me came with a business you didn't deserve. You poisoned the well, David. You broke something that can't be fixed. This money is the last thing you will ever get from me or from this family." He just stood there, holding the check, tears welling in his eyes. "But Frank, I'm your brother." "Blood may be thicker than water," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "But integrity is thicker than both. Now get out of my office." He left without another word. I watched him walk out of the yard, a man who had everything and threw it all away for greed. I never saw him again. It's been a few years since all that happened. We finished the community center, and it's the finest building in the county. It stands as a testament to doing things the right way. Miller and Sons is thriving, built on the same principles of quality and loyalty that my father established all those years ago. I've learned that a true legacy isn't about a name on a sign or the amount of money in a bank account. It's about the quality of your work and the honor in your heart. It's about building things that last, not just out of concrete and steel, but out of trust and respect. David thought he was stealing a business, but the business was never the real inheritance. The real inheritance was the set of values our father taught me. In the end, I didn't just get the company back. I saved my father's name. And that's a legacy that no amount of money can buy.